The episode opens on a wall of sound, archival spokespeople in impeccable suits, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of evasion, saying the same thing 100 different ways. We have no knowledge, no credible evidence, not applicable to current policy. The images are cooler than the voices. Snow-white test footage from the Cold War era, ships turning in steel-gray seas, a grainy aerial view of a vast desert grid etched into the sand like a forgotten blueprint. Underneath it all, hands rest on a weathered kitchen table. An old Navy man's hands, nicked and trembling from years of service. The skin thin but the grip still iron-strong, as if holding on to memories that refuse to fade. When he finally speaks, he doesn't start with an accusation. He starts with a question he's rehearsed for decades. What exactly was Project 112, and why were we told it never happened? He was a decontamination specialist aboard U.S. Navy vessels, the kind of rating that keeps crews calm by pretending there's nothing to fear, even as you scrub invisible threats from every surface. In his memory, the danger is not explosions or fire. It's the invisible things you can't point a finger at, the silent invaders that slip through seals and masks. He remembers endless drills with gas masks and mops, sealed hatches slamming shut like coffin lids, a metallic taste like old coins at the back of his throat that lingered for days. He recalls the order that stopped questions at the lips. Stand to and do not break formation. The camera lingers on his eyes, not to mine them for tears, but to show the calculation behind them, the sharp mind of a man who has pieced together fragments over a lifetime. He is a witness who has learned to measure every word, knowing that speaking out could once mean court-martial, and even now it means reliving the betrayal. Across town, a determined reporter pulls a dusty banker's box from a dimly lit storage unit, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten secrets. Inside are rumors bound in rubber bands, yellowed newspaper clippings from the 1970s hinting at shadowy DoD programs, FOIA responses with whole pages blacked out like censored confessions, letters from wives and widows who kept ship logs like rosaries, praying for answers that never came. This is not his first investigation, but it is the first one where the government's denial feels less like a rebuttal and more like a scripted performance, rehearsed in boardrooms to deflect scrutiny. He pins phrases above his desk: test article, aerosol dissemination, biological simulant, and draws threads to place names that repeat like a chant. Fort Douglas, Utah. The Pacific Ocean, Gerstle River, Alaska. Project 112, he begins to understand, was never a single test. It was an umbrella, a bureaucratic weather system that promised realistic environments and operational conditions for evaluating chemical and biological weapons. Launched in 1962 under President Kennedy's directive to bolster defenses against Soviet threats, it ran until 1973, encompassing over 50 planned tests across multiple branches of the military. Its naval wing had a name, Operation Shad, standing for Shipboard Hazard and Defense. That sounds almost benign until you picture the fish breaking the surface of dark water, gasping in contaminated seas. But the umbrella's edge is broader than the sea. There are hints of land trials in cold valleys and tropical coves, collaborations with allies in Canada and the UK, even tests in Panama's jungles, and a coordinating center that exists mostly in the margins of old memos, buried in redacted files. The more the reporter reads, the more he hears the silence as part of the design, a deliberate veil to protect not just national security, but the architects who orchestrated it all. Back at the kitchen table, the veteran unfolds a brittle notebook, a private log kept at risk of court-martial, its pages filled with cryptic entries that could have landed him in the brig if discovered. Contains no overt secrets, not in the conventional sense. Just dates, ship positions, weather conditions, the length of a drill, the way the air in a passageway felt oily and heavy, the cough that moved through berthing like a rumor spreading unchecked. He never wrote the word agent. He didn't need to. The shorthand of sailors, 3 lines, a compass arrow, a number, carries its own kind of accusation, a code that only those who lived it could decipher. The reporter copies the entries meticulously and overlays them on declassified timelines released only after congressional pressure in the early 2000s. Points begin to align, like stars forming a constellation of deceit. The cold images give way to sound. the staccato of a teletype machine clacking out classified orders, the thud of a rubber stamp approving shipments of unknown canisters, the whine of a projector filling a wall with looping film of white plumes drifting across water, captured in grainy black and white for internal reviews. The narrator wonders aloud. If these were only simulants, why the secrecy long after the Cold War thawed? Why the carefully hedged letters to veterans who ask for care, denying benefits for illnesses that match the symptoms of exposure? Why the repeated phrase, unable to confirm exposure, when the dates on those form letters match the dates in a sailor's private hand, down to the hour? A former shipmate appears in a home video from the 90s, younger then, already sick, his face gaunt under a baseball cap. He laughs off the past as weird training exercises we couldn't talk about. But the laugh curdles at the edges, turning into a wheeze that hints at damaged lungs. In the background, on a coffee table, sits a framed photo of their ship cutting through foam, the USS Granville S. Hall, one of the vessels used in multiple shad tests. The reporter pauses the tape and zooms in. Not on faces, not on ribbons, but on a chalkboard barely visible on the bulkhead. Scrawled in grease pencil, Condition Zebra, the order for maximum watertight integrity, sealing the ship against threats from outside, or, in this case, trapping the threats inside. You don't call Zebra for nothing. It's reserved for real dangers, not mere drills. We return to the public record, now partially declassified after years of veteran advocacy and GAO investigations. The same phrases recur with metronomic precision, within acceptable limits, for the purposes of modeling, no adverse events documented. Words designed to drain away feeling, to reduce human suffering to statistical footnotes. Yet documents have fingerprints, and this corpus bears the same smudge over and over: a destination code, a routing slip, a headquarters that doesn't behave like a headquarters, routing everything through post office boxes to obscure trails. In one faint carbon copy, a destination name survives the black marker like a watermark. It's not a base or a laboratory most people would recognize. It's something else, a nerve center for the unimaginable. The veteran watches as the reporter lays their timelines side by side, paper after paper, until the kitchen table is a mosaic of ink and revelation. Somewhere inside the grid is a center, an office that allocated ships, scheduled flights, chose valleys and islands, and translated policy into plumes of potential death. The camera pulls back, the table becomes a map, the map becomes a question, and the question becomes an address the audience has never heard spoken aloud. Deseret Test Center, the shadowy hub where the threads of Project 112 converged. The denials fade under the title of a place that was never meant to be the lead in anyone's story. A place with a biblical name and a modern mandate, drawing from the Book of Mormon's Deseret, symbolizing the honeybee's industrious hive, fitting for a center buzzing with classified activity. A place where silence was both strategy and shield. The trail from a sailor's trembling hands and a reporter's wall of clippings converges on a single phrase stamped in purple ink. The first solid door our investigation will push against next. Deseret Test Center. The camera pans across the Utah desert, an expanse so wide and barren it seems built for secrets, with Dugway Proving Ground nearby, a sprawling 800,000-acre site where the U.S. Army tested everything from nerve gases to anthrax simulants. At first glance, there is nothing here but sagebrush and wind whipping up dust devils that dance like ghosts. But buried inside a mountain of paperwork is a name that repeats like a ghost. Deseret Test Center. Not a base, not a fort, not a place with gates and signposts that scream restricted. Rather, a phantom headquarters, operating through post office boxes and coded directives from its original location at Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City, before merging operations with Dugway in 1968. Its mission, according to the fragments we can see in declassified fact sheets, was coordination. But coordination of what? The question hangs like dust in the desert air, thick and unrelenting. Declassified memos from the early 1960s tell part of the story, released only after persistent FOIA battles by veterans groups. They speak of operational evaluation, joint service requirements, and environmental dissemination studies. The words feel clinical, drained of emotion, as if discussing weather patterns rather than weapons that could wipe out cities. Yet every line suggests something immense, an umbrella program, stretching from frozen tundra to the open sea, involving the Army, Navy, Air Force, and even international partners. Project 112. Its official purpose was defensive, to understand vulnerabilities and develop countermeasures against chemical and biological attacks. But the architecture of secrecy, the way it threaded itself through multiple agencies, told a darker truth. This was not a small experiment. It was a system, one that exposed thousands of unwitting service members to risks they were never briefed on, all in the name of Cold War preparedness. The reporter unrolls a newly obtained diagram, a spiderweb of arrows pointing from Deseret to Navy fleets in the Pacific, Air Force units dropping payloads over Alaska, Army proving grounds in Utah's own deserts, and even collaborative tests at Canada's Suffield Experimental Station in Ralston, Alberta. Each arrow is a line of command, invisible to the sailors who stood on deck or the soldiers who stood in valleys, unaware they were data points in a grand experiment. The coordination was meticulous. Equipment delivered via unmarked convoys, protocols distributed in sealed envelopes, results returned to the Ghost headquarters for analysis. It's the kind of bureaucracy designed to leave no fingerprints, only numbers, code names, and acronyms that mask the human cost. Our veteran leans in, scanning the diagram with eyes widened by recognition. He has never seen these papers before, yet the names jump out like echoes from his past. Autumn Gold, Copperhead, Shady Grove. He taps the paper with a stiff finger, his nail clicking against the surface. We used to hear those in briefings, not explained, just mentioned, like code words you weren't supposed to repeat. His voice drifts off, but the connection is unmistakable. The phrases in his personal log, once just odd words jotted in the margins, line up with the official test titles now emerging from the archive. Autumn Gold, for instance, involved spraying Bacillus globigii, a bacterial simulant mimicking anthrax, over Navy ships off Hawaii to test how it penetrated hulls. Copperhead used zinc-cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent tracer, dispersed over Canadian forests to track wind patterns. Shady Grove went further, releasing live Serratia marcescens, a bacterium once thought harmless but later linked to infections, across Pacific waters. Personal memory and institutional record finally touch, bridging decades of doubt. We cut to black and white footage of a 1963 Pentagon briefing, a stern general droning about scientific progress and defensive preparedness. His uniform starched, his delivery as emotionless as the data he presents. The reporter overlays it with declassified letters stamped for official use only, whispering the subtext the public was never supposed to hear. Deseret wasn't conducting tests. It was orchestrating a symphony of them, over 50 in total, some canceled due to weather or ethics concerns that surfaced too late. Different climates, different conditions, one objective: to watch how chemical and biological agents moved through the world we all live in, from arid deserts to humid tropics, measuring persistence, penetration, and potential lethality. The sailor's eyes harden as the reporter speaks, his jaw tightening with the realization. For decades he thought his experience was isolated, a strange drill on a strange day aboard the USS Navarro or one of the other light tugs used as floating labs. Now he sees it wasn't an accident. It was a piece of a puzzle designed far away from the rolling deck where he stood, in air-conditioned offices at Deseret where scientists plotted coordinates like chess moves. They made the ocean a laboratory, he mutters, half to himself, his words carrying the weight of betrayal. The reporter doesn't answer. He doesn't have to. The pattern is already unfolding before them, revealing not just tests but a web of international involvement. Tests at Portondown in the UK with similar agents, or in Panama's rainforests where tropical humidity was key to understanding agent decay. Archival stills of warehouses flash across the screen, crates labeled with vague military codes like DTC Test 68-50, tanks of chemicals disguised as routine supplies, sealed envelopes marked return to sender if undeliverable to avoid paper trails. The shadow of Deseret is everywhere, but the center itself remains untouchable. No photographs of its offices survive in the public domain, no full roster of its staff, many of whom were civilians with top-secret clearances. Just signatures on routing slips and typed initials on the bottom corner of reports. Faded but damning. an organization that managed to exist without being seen, blending into the military-industrial complex like camouflage in the desert. The tension rises as the narrator asks, how do you prove the existence of a headquarters when the government itself refuses to admit it ever had walls, even after its closure in 1973? The answer lies not in the desert sands, but in the testimonies of those who lived the experiments without knowing their name, the sailors who inhaled the mists, the soldiers who patrolled contaminated zones. The veteran closes his notebook, the reporter closes the file. Both know where this trail is pointing next, to the Navy, to the decks that became test platforms, and to an operation with a name as quiet as the fish it borrowed, Operation Shad. But before we dive into the waves, consider this. Deseret wasn't just a coordinator. It was the brain, pulsing with data from tests that spanned continents, data that could have saved lives if shared. But instead, it was buried, leaving veterans to fight for recognition alone. The ocean, vast and indifferent, was never supposed to be a laboratory. Yet, in the early 1960s, American warships became moving test tubes, their crews unknowing subjects in an experiment cloaked as defense readiness. The codename was simple, Operation Shad, but what unfolded at sea was anything but, involving 21 completed tests out of 39 planned, with ships like the USS George Eastman serving as floating platforms for aerosol releases. From the bridge, it looked like routine maneuvers, ships steaming in formation under clear skies. From the deck, it felt like another drill, men in fatigues practicing for hypothetical threats. But to the men sealed inside their steel compartments, the air itself had been turned against them, laced with substances that tested the limits of human endurance. Our veteran remembers the alarms most vividly. Not the thunder of guns or the clamor of damage control teams, but a strange, stilted warning broadcast over the 1MC, prepare for dissemination. Then came the order to secure all hatches, to lock the ship down in what sailors call condition zebra, every door dogged tight, every vent closed against intrusion. At first, it felt like a fire drill without flames, a precaution against imagined enemies. But then came the mist, clouds drifting across the water, sprayed from low-flying for Skyhawk aircraft, towed barges, or sometimes from experimental devices mounted on their own ship, like the M105 sprayers rigged to release precise plumes. They were told it was harmless. Training, nothing more. Still, the air burned the throat, eyes watered as if from tear gas, and a metallic taste lingered long after the drill was done, sometimes accompanied by headaches that pounded like waves against the hull. Official documents, declassified in batches starting in 2002, described these plumes as simulants, stand-ins for deadlier agents, safe by design. Harmless bacteria like Bacillus globigii, fluorescent particles such as zinc cadmium sulfide, benign compounds like trioctyl phosphite. Yet the records we've obtained are careful in their wording, generally regarded as safe, no known harmful effects in limited exposure. Phrases chosen to reassure or perhaps to obscure the fact that some tests used live agents. Sarin gas in the Eager Bell test, VX nerve agent in Fearless Johnny, staphylococcal enterotoxin B, a toxin that causes severe food poisoning in Flower Drum. For the men on deck, those words didn't match their memories. Coughing fits that echoed through the berthing areas, irritated eyes that required saline rinses, the sense that their bodies were not simply reacting to nerves but to something real, something invasive that settled in the lungs like an unwelcome guest. The camera lingers on the ship's logbook, faded pencil entries noting drills, exercises, weather. Nothing unusual, until the sudden gaps, deliberate omissions where pages skip or entries read only as classified operations. Those blank spaces are louder than words, screaming of cover-ups. The veteran flips through the pages, pointing to one such entry with a finger scarred from years of handling decontamination gear. That was the day we stood under the cloud during Test 64-4. Half note. They wrote training. But no training I'd ever had made me sick for a week, with nausea that kept me from chow. His voice is steady, but the accusation hangs heavy, backed by VA records showing clusters of similar symptoms among Shad participants. The journalist overlays the sailors' recollections with declassified schematics, diagrams showing aerosol dispersal patterns across ships, arrows indicating how particles were expected to infiltrate compartments through tiny gaps in seals or ventilation systems. The science is chilling in its precision. Measurements of penetration rates, survival times of agents in saltwater air, the predicted number of crew that would be exposed without protective gear. In the margins, cold math replaces human faces, equations calculating LD50, the lethal dose for half the population. Yet every figure corresponds to real lungs breathing in the mist, real eyes stinging from contact, real sailors told to keep silent under threat of national security oaths. A second voice enters the narrative. A shipmate, recorded years earlier in a veterans meeting organized by groups like the Vietnam Veterans of America. His memory is fragmented, pieced together from nightmares, but he recalls standing topside as a mist drifted down during the Scarlet Sage test. "We laughed at first," he says on the grainy tape, his chuckle turning into a cough, called it sea fog or some prank from the flyboys, but then, headaches that felt like hammers, burning skin that peeled like a bad sunburn. We weren't laughing after that, especially when the doc said it was just allergies. His story echoes the first, giving weight to what official reports insist never happened. Long-term effects like respiratory issues, cancers, and neurological disorders that VA studies in 2016 found no statistical increase in, but veterans swear are linked. Archival film rolls. Destroyers like the USS Herbert J. Thomas cutting through the Pacific, aircraft releasing white streaks against blue sky, the plumes curling like smoke from a distant fire. A narrator's voice from the past describes them as routine exercises in fleet readiness. But the juxtaposition is deliberate, the modern voice reminding us that the fleet was not preparing for war. It was being used as a test chamber. A chamber sealed tight with sailors inside, their bodies becoming unwitting sensors for data fed back to Deseret. As the camera returns to the present, the reporter spreads another set of documents across the table. Exposure reports, medical summaries, all marked confidential and only released after lawsuits. None admit harm. None list names, reducing men to anonymized ID numbers. They reduce symptoms to variables in a spreadsheet. But the alignment between the logs and the memories is undeniable. Something was released. Something was inhaled. And someone in the shadows at Deseret knew exactly what the outcome would be, documenting it for future doctrines while leaving the exposed to fend for themselves. The chapter closes on a slow pullback from the ship at sea. Serene, almost beautiful, sunlight glinting off the waves as if mocking the hidden poison. But beneath that calm lies a toxic question that refuses to sink. What, exactly, drifted through the air that day? And how many other tests remain unacknowledged? The answer lies ahead with those who operated the machines, the sailors who were not just exposed but made to ensure the exposure happened. That trail leads us directly to the next layer of truth. The lingering trace left in the water and beyond to the frozen north where the same experiments took root in ice. The reconstruction begins with maps spread across a table, nautical charts plotting courses through the Pacific, weather reports from the 1960s showing wind vectors, faded diagrams stamped confidential detailing dispersal patterns like battle plans. The reporter traces the line of a ship's course off the California coast during Test 63-1, Eager Bell, the arrows showing prevailing winds carrying agents toward the fleet, the dotted overlay of how simulants like methyl acetoacetate were expected to behave. It is no longer an abstraction. This was not just theory on paper, but a living test, executed with men in uniform standing under drifting clouds, their trust in command exploited. The camera pulls back to reveal our second key witness. A former Navy technician, now an old man whose hands still know the motions of switches and levers, calloused from years of maintaining the very equipment that released the mists. He describes his duty without hesitation, his voice gravelly from a lifetime of chain-smoking to calm nerves frayed by secrets. His job was not to question orders but to make systems work, calibrating valves on the spray rigs, checking gauges for pressure, and finally throwing the switch that turned a piece of machinery from idle to dissemination mode. He didn't know exactly what was being released. No one did, except perhaps the officers from Deseret who flew in for oversight. That ignorance was part of the design, compartmentalization to prevent leaks. But he remembers the aftermath. Coughing that spread through the mess deck like wildfire, watery eyes treated with boric acid washes, a stinging sensation on skin that didn't fade until well after the drills ended, sometimes leaving rashes that itched for weeks. Archival documents confirm his account with unnerving precision. A declassified operations plan shows the exact date, the exact ship, the USS Carpenter, and the dispersal method. Aircraft releases of sarin in low concentrations to test decontamination procedures. Next to it, typed in sterile military jargon, are the test objectives: to measure aerosol penetration into interior spaces under full watertight integrity. Translation: to see how deeply the mist could infiltrate the lungs of men locked inside steel walls, even with masks donned. The alignment between testimony and text is undeniable. The timing, the ship's location off San Diego, even the weather conditions match, down to the 15-knot winds that carried the plume perfectly. The veteran, sitting beside the reporter, listens in silence as his shipmate speaks, their eyes meeting in shared recognition. Their memories converge. One recalling the orders from above, barked over intercoms, the other the sensations from below, the acrid smell seeping through filters. They are two halves of the same story, sealed for decades under layers of denial, now unlocked by fact sheets from the DoD's 2002 releases. The technician leans forward, voice dropping as if secrecy still binds him, his whisper carrying across the room. We weren't simulating anything. We were measuring it. They wanted to know how far it went, how fast it spread, even if it meant we breathed it in to prove the point. The film cuts to a slow-motion reenactment. A fine spray released against the backdrop of a gray horizon, drifting toward a ship's superstructure like a living entity. Air currents twist and funnel the mist, pushing it into passageways, down vents, into the very spaces meant to keep sailors safe. Engine rooms, galleys, sleeping quarters. A narrator's voice underscores the point. Warships, icons of strength and security, symbols of American might, were deliberately transformed into test chambers, their crews into instruments of data collection, all while Deseret analysts back in Utah crunched numbers on agent viability in saltwater environments. In one haunting moment, the technician recalls a specific order during the Purple Sage test: to log any signs of aerosol intrusion, no matter how minor. He remembers seeing a thin film forming along a bulkhead inside a compartment, shimmering like oil on water, and reporting it up the chain with a sense of dread. The response came back curt and final. Noted. Resume normal operations. There was no discussion of health, no acknowledgement of risk, just data collected, test complete, move on to the next release. He pauses, adding a detail he'd long suppressed. One guy in my division passed out during cleanup. They said dehydration, but we all knew better. The camera returns to the present, the reporter laying the declassified schematic side by side with the technician's testimony. The overlay is perfect, the points align like coordinates on a target, revealing not just SHAD but links to land tests like DDC 68-50 in Utah, where similar agents were dispersed over desert grids. This is no longer a story of speculation or rumor. It is a story where lived experience and government record meet on the same page, corroborated by GAO reports criticizing DoD for slow declassifications. The sailor and the technician sit together for the first time in years. Their gray hair and lined faces a testament to time's toll. Their accounts, once isolated fragments shared only at VFW halls, now form a chain stronger than any denial. And as they look down at the evidence, the question shifts from what happened at sea to how far the program reached beyond it, to the icy expanses where winds carried the same threats. The investigation widens its scope, pulling us away from the ocean spray and toward frozen valleys where the same clouds drifted in different winds. The next stop, the cold testing grounds of Alaska, where Project 112 turned the Arctic into a proving ground for invisible wars. The screen fills with white silence, snowfields stretching into the horizon under a leaden sky, mountains jagged like broken teeth piercing the clouds. Alaska in winter, the Gerstle River test site near Delta Junction, a remote outpost chosen for its isolation. It looks untouched, eternal, a frozen wilderness where temperatures plunge to minus 40 degrees. But hidden in this stillness are traces of another battlefield, one that never made the headlines or the history books. Here, during the 1960s, Project 112 found its northern frontier in tests like DDC Test 64-2, Devil Hole, and others under the land-based umbrella. The tests were simple in theory, brutal in practice. Release clouds into the freezing air from ground sprayers or artillery shells and watch how they moved across valleys, how long they lingered in the snowpack, how far the sub-zero winds could carry them before the agents froze or dissipated. No soldiers standing in formation this time, at least not overtly. Instead, the land itself was the subject, and the people who lived nearby, Inuit communities, trappers, military personnel on base, were the unacknowledged witnesses, their exposure dismissed as collateral. Declassified field notes, sparse and technical, reveal phrases like dispersion over snowpack and evaluation of downwind drift in Arctic conditions. The language is mechanical, as if the agents being released, simulants like E. coli or actual pathogens in controlled doses, were no different from smoke or fog from a training grenade. But journals kept by local residents, unearthed from Alaskan archives, tell another story. Sightings of strange white mists rolling off ridges, lingering longer than any storm cloud should, sometimes glowing faintly under UV lights used for tracers. Hunters spoke of caribou scattering from invisible threats, their herds acting erratic for days, of coughs and nosebleeds that followed the strange weather, symptoms mirroring those from bacterial exposures. In the official record, those voices do not exist, buried under classifications that lasted until the 2000s. Into this frozen silence steps another character. An environmental scientist, an Alaskan native who has spent decades tracing patterns of rare illnesses across the region, his work funded by grants from organizations like the EPA. He holds stacks of hand-drawn maps dotted with pins, cancers clustering in small villages, neurological disorders like Parkinson's in former base workers, birth defects in children born post-1960s. His voice is calm but insistent, laced with the accent of someone raised in the north. This was not nature. Something foreign was introduced into these valleys. Agents like Francisella tularensis, the bacterium behind tularemia, tested for its cold weather resilience. And the record of it lives not in government files, but in people's bodies, in soil samples that still show traces decades later. The veteran listens, unsettled, his face paling as memories flood back. His experiences were of steel decks and ocean winds, but as the scientist speaks, he hears the same logic. Exposure, drift, containment tested against human life, all coordinated from Deseret to simulate Soviet attacks in varied climates. What he endured aboard ship was not an isolated exercise. It was part of a wider design, one that included tests like Sundown in Alaska, where Q-fever simulants were released to study aerosol travel over ice. The sailors' coughs and the hunters' nosebleeds are pieces of the same experiment, one that stretched from salt water to frozen tundra, ignoring borders and ethics. Archival images flash by, army trucks unloading drums onto icy ground at Big Delta, soldiers in heavy parkas unspooling hoses into the snow, C-123 aircraft dispersing faint trails against the pale sky, the plumes freezing midair into crystalline hazards. The documents describe these as environmental dissemination trials, phrasing precise and clinical, but hinting at collaborations with Canada's Defence Research Board for cross-border wind studies. The footage, though silent, tells another truth. These were rehearsals for war, rehearsals that made the natural world itself a proving ground, with wildlife and civilians as unintended variables. The journalist spreads the maps on the table beside the ship's log and the dispersal schematics from SHAD. A new pattern emerges, different terrain, same objective. On water, the test was to see how aerosol entered sealed compartments. On land, it was to watch how clouds traveled across valleys and settled in communities, persisting longer in cold air. Different backdrops, one logic. The spread of the invisible data that could inform offensive strategies as much as defensive ones. The environmentalist lowers his voice, pointing to a cluster of pins on the Alaskan map near Fort Greely. This isn't just history. The consequences are still here. Elevated rates of autoimmune diseases in descendants, contaminated groundwater that locals drank from. Generations later, we're still counting the costs, still fighting for cleanup funds. His words hang heavy, a reminder that experiments may end, but their echoes continue, rippling through ecosystems and bloodlines. The chapter closes on a wide aerial shot of a frozen valley, clouds curling like ghosts against the mountains, the wind howling in the audio mix. The narrator poses the next question. If the Arctic was chosen for its winds and emptiness, where else might the project have gone searching, perhaps to humid jungles or allied lands? The answer lies thousands of miles away, across the Pacific, where the tropics would provide their own laboratory, and secrecy would follow the mist into the humid nights of Hawaii, and beyond to Panama and even the UK's misty downs. The scene shifts from frozen valleys to a place that looks like paradise. Palm trees sway in gentle trade winds, waves break softly against golden beaches, and tourists laugh under the Hawaiian sun, oblivious to the shadows beneath. But just beyond the postcards, another story was unfolding. In the 1960s, Project 112 extended its reach here, to islands like Oahu and the Big Island, where the tropical air and ocean currents offered scientists a new kind of laboratory for tests like autumn gold and shady grove. The tests were quiet, executed at night when the beaches were empty and the winds carried secrets inland, sometimes perilously close to Honolulu's outskirts. Official reports, now declassified, describe the purpose in familiar language: to study aerosol persistence in humid climates and evaluate shipboard protection in subtropical conditions. The phrasing sounds harmless, almost academic, like a meteorology study. Yet when mapped against ship logs and weather records, the scale becomes clear. Sprays were released offshore from barges or aircraft, their drift tracked by instruments on land, samplers hidden in palm groves or on remote atolls. In some cases, the dispersals happened alarmingly close to shipping lanes, even near populated areas like Pearl Harbor, where Navy bases doubled as test sites. To the men carrying out orders, it was just another exercise. To the islanders who woke to unusual mists clinging to the coastline, it was something they were never told to expect, dismissed as morning fog by authorities. One former Navy signalman recalls the nights vividly, his story drawn from a 2008 congressional hearing transcript. He was assigned to relay coded messages during offloading operations at Kahoolawe, an uninhabited island used for bombing practice. Containers marked only with numbers, DDC shipments from Utah, were unloaded under strict orders. No records, no logs, no questions, floodlights casting long shadows on the docks. "We weren't supposed to even write down the times," he says, his voice low, as if secrecy still clings to him like humidity. He remembers the heavy crates, the guarded looks from Deseret observers, and the strange instructions to clear decks during dispersal runs, sometimes involving live Coxiella bernicii in Shady Grove, a Q fever agent tested for its heat resistance. "We knew it wasn't training. We just didn't know what it was. Until years later, when the rashes and fevers started." Archival weather charts show how the trade winds of Hawaii carried clouds across valleys and into towns like Hilo, where residents reported odd odors. While the government insisted that only benign simulants were used, a series of internal memos suggest otherwise. Trials involving compounds like staphylococcal enterotoxin B, which causes violent illness, or even taboon in trace amounts for decontamination studies. And always, the pattern repeats. No names, no individual exposures documented. Just numbers in a chart, variables in a model, with health monitoring limited to immediate reactions, ignoring long-term risks like gastrointestinal disorders. The journalist overlays maps of dispersal with testimonies from islanders who remember the strange fog, collected from local newspapers and oral histories. Farmers spoke of leaves spotted with residue that never came from the sky before, crops wilting inexplicably. Fishermen described waters that smelled off after certain nights, a sharpness that lingered in the air, fish surfacing belly up in test zones. None of these accounts ever made it into official files. For decades, they were dismissed as rumor or superstition. Now, paired with declassified diagrams, they reveal the outline of hidden operations, including links to Panama Canal zone tests where jungle humidity was key for Agent Jungle Jim, releasing simulants over rainforests to mimic Vietnam conditions. The veteran sailor, hearing the signalman's account, feels the familiar sting of recognition, his own memories of Pacific mists mirroring these. Though thousands of miles apart, their stories are linked by the same choreography. Sealed orders from Deseret, unexplained clouds, the command to remain silent under pain of punishment. What happened on the deck of a destroyer in the Pacific mirrored what happened on the beaches of Hawaii. And even further, In Panama's steamy trails where agents like Venezuelan equine encephalitis were simulated. The logic was identical: test the spread, record the data, deny the exposure, all while expanding to allied sites like Ralston in Canada for copperhead, dispersing tracers over prairies. Footage of tropical sunsets gives way to grainy black and white clips. Men in uniforms unloading containers under floodlights at Ford Island. Instruments arranged in neat lines along the sand, trails of mist drifting inland toward volcanic slopes. The beauty of the islands becomes a backdrop for experiments meant to remain unseen. Their danger hidden beneath layers of euphemism and denial, with Desiret's fingerprints on every canister. The environmental scientist from Alaska returns, his maps now joined with charts of the Pacific and even Panama. He points to the through line: cold winds in Devil Hole, humid breezes in Flower Drum, ocean currents in Half Note. Different climates, same question: how far can an invisible weapon travel, and how does environment affect lethality? The breadth of the program is undeniable now. From tundra to tropics to jungles, the Earth itself was bent into a test site, with over 5,900 service members exposed, many without consent. As the camera fades, the reporter pins another sheet onto his investigation wall. A map showing Ralston, Canada, where zinc-cadmium sulfide was sprayed, linking to respiratory complaints there too. The connections are no longer scattered. They form a lattice of operations stretching across oceans and continents. But for every uncovered document, another is marked by black ink, words hidden behind redactions. The story is growing, but to move forward, the journalist and the veterans must now confront the wall of secrecy itself. And that wall is built of paper, fortified by decades of bureaucratic inertia. The story shifts from landscapes to filing cabinets, from clouds of mist to walls of ink that blot out truths. The reporter now stands inside a cramped office stacked with bankers' boxes. His battlefield is paper, not open sea, but the stakes are just as high. He files requests under the Freedom of Information Act, asking for test records, exposure logs, medical reports from Desiret's archives. Weeks later, the responses arrive. Thick envelopes filled with pages where entire paragraphs are smothered under black bars. Redactions so heavy they turn documents into riddles. What remains are fragments, dates without context, codes without definitions, and the same phrase repeating like a drumbeat. Unable to confirm exposure, even for tests like Test 69-32 in Utah, where live VX was used. For the veteran, these letters are more than evasions. They are verdicts, denying him VA benefits for conditions like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease that match exposure profiles. He applies for medical care only to receive the same cold reply: no evidence that he was ever part of a test, despite his service on shed vessels. The man who once stood under clouds of aerosol is now told, decades later, that there is no record of it, ignoring the 2003 Health Care for Veterans of Project 112 Act that aimed to provide priority care. His body may shake, his lungs may fail, but in the government's eyes, nothing ever happened. His anger simmers quietly as he lays the denial letter next to his personal log, the words "training operation," mocking him like an old wound reopened. Families begin to surface in the narrative. Wives who kept every telegram from deployments, sons who inherited boxes of letters yellowed by time, daughters piecing together service records with help from advocacy groups like the Project 112/Shed Veterans Association. On kitchen tables across the country, they reconstruct timelines of deployments, mapping them against the few test names released in declassified indexes: Fearless Johnny in the Pacific, where VX was dispersed; Rapid Tan in the UK testing sarin at Porton Down. A pattern emerges. Sailors assigned to ships linked with Operation Shad, soldiers sent to Alaskan valleys for Devil Hole, Marines rotated through Hawaiian beaches for Shady Grove, even airmen involved in Panama's jungle releases. The official record denies exposure, but the lived record refuses to be silent, bolstered by 2002 congressional hearings where veterans testified to Congress about their plight. The journalist follows these threads, pinning together scraps of evidence on a corkboard that spans an entire wall. Memos with code words like DTC 70-50, log entries of unexplained drills, testimonies of sudden illnesses that baffled doctors. He begins to see how the redactions themselves tell a story. Clusters of black ink over substance lists, hiding names like soman or lewisite, Where the black ink falls hardest is often where the truth hides deepest, like in reports from collaborative tests with the UK, where allies shared data but not accountability. He reads the emptiness between the lines and finds outlines of a network. The same agencies, the DoD, the Chemical Corps, the same signatories from Deseret, always pointing back toward that invisible command in Utah. Into this growing archive steps a new figure, an attorney specializing in veterans' rights, who has taken on cases from SHAD survivors denied care, drawing from precedents set by Agent Orange litigation. He has boxes of his own class action suits filed in the 2000s, appeals to the VA board. To him, the denials are not just bureaucratic obstacles. They are a strategy designed to wear down claimants. The system is built to outlast you, he explains, his tone sharp as a lawyer's cross-examination. Every page withheld, every benefit denied, is time bought. The hope is that your case dies before you do, saving the government millions in payouts. His words land heavily, reminding the audience that secrecy is not only a matter of security, but of survival. For the exposed, it's a fight for life. For the system, it's avoiding liability for exposing 6,000 men. As the lawyer speaks, we see the faces of men in faded photographs, their uniforms crisp, their smiles full of youth and patriotism. Beside them, images of the same men decades later. Wheelchairs in VA waiting rooms, oxygen tanks hissing softly, shaking hands holding denial letters stamped with recent dates. The contrast is brutal, humanizing the statistics from IOM studies that found no overall health differences but acknowledged individual sufferings. The government's language may reduce them to abstractions, test subjects. But their suffering is vivid, undeniable. From skin cancers to heart conditions potentially linked to tracers like zinc-cadmium sulfide. The veteran, once reluctant to speak, now begins to see his story as part of something larger. He is not an outlier. He is one of many, connected through online forums and reunions where SHAD vets share scans and symptoms. He looks across a table crowded with others like him. Sailors from the USS Power, soldiers from Gerstle River, airmen from Panama, each clutching their own fragments of the truth, some with medals for service, others with medical bills piling up. Together, their voices form a chorus that cannot be erased with a black marker, amplified by media exposés and GAO criticisms of DoD's incomplete disclosures. The camera lingers on the attorney's office wall, where case files are stacked high, each labeled with a name: John Doe from Autumn Gold, Jane Roe's father from Copperhead. One by one, these names transform the story from scattered testimonies into a collective demand for answers, echoing the 2012 push by Representative Mike Thompson for expanded benefits. The paper wall that once stood as an obstacle now becomes a battleground, pocked with legal victories like the 2008 legislation providing exams. But even the thickest walls sometimes crack. And just when the fight seems destined to stall in endless bureaucracy, a forgotten document surfaces. A discovery that promises to shift the balance from rumor to proof. A document that names names, lists substances beyond the admitted simulants, and reveals what was really in those clouds, including live agents in tests like flower drum phase 1, where staphylococcal toxin was aerosolized. The pursuit of truth is about to break wide open, leading to confrontations that could topple the remaining barriers. The breakthrough arrives not with a grand revelation, but in the quiet shuffle of forgotten paperwork unearthed from a DoD archive during a routine declassification review. In a stack of old correspondence, routine memos about supply chains, receipts for canisters shipped from Edgewood Arsenal, routing slips from Deseret, there is an attachment that should have been destroyed decades ago, per protocol. It is a table, typed neatly on onion skin paper, almost innocently, listing specific compounds alongside dosage levels, dispersal rates, and exposure targets for tests like test 66 to 13, speckled start. For the first time, the words are not vague euphemisms like simulant or test article. They are chemical names recognizable to anyone who studies warfare, some of them nerve agents like sarin and VX, others biological toxins like Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus, far removed from the harmless substances the government admitted to using in initial 2002 fact sheets. The journalist spreads the pages across the table, his hands shaking slightly with the adrenaline of discovery. This is no longer circumstantial. This is evidence, corroborated by later releases showing live agents in at least 4 SHAD tests. He reads aloud the chilling precision of the entries. Aerosolized VX, dosage per cubic meter, 0.1 milligrams per cubic meter, targeted for skin penetration studies. Sarin, persistence measurement in humid air, with tracers for tracking. Each line is paired with a date and a location, and more than once, the coordinates match the very ships and valleys our veterans described: the Pacific for Fearless Johnny, where VX was released over tugs; Alaska for Sundown, testing tularemia. The ink, though faded, carries the weight of truth the denials tried to erase, revealing that some simulants were actually pathogens like Serratia marcescens, which caused outbreaks in hospitals when used elsewhere. The technician, sitting nearby, studies the list in silence, his face draining of color. After a long pause, he nods slowly, his breath catching. "There were days," he says, voice rough with emotion, "when we switched to a different feed canister. No explanation, just a signal from above. Phase 2 commencing. We could tell it wasn't the same stuff. The smell was sharper, like garlic or rotten fruit, the reaction stronger, men vomiting over the rails. We didn't know the names then. But seeing this now, it explains the tremors I've had since '68. His words trail off, but the implication is devastating. Those days were not simulations. They were live trials, testing real weapons on American soil and seas, with decontaminants like beta-propiolactone used afterward, itself a carcinogen. The veteran opens his medical file, pages yellowed with time and dotted with VA stamps, and lays it beside the table of compounds. The alignment is brutal in its simplicity. Date of dispersal: May 17, 1964, during Scarlet Sage with sarin simulant, but the document reveals actual trace sarin. On the same page, date of first reported neurological symptoms: May 18, dizziness and pins and needles in limbs. Another line shows exposure logged in the Pacific, matched with the onset of chronic respiratory issues noted only weeks later, symptoms matching nerve agent effects. For years, these timelines seemed like coincidences, unlucky breaks in an old man's health. Now they form a pattern that cannot be ignored, supported by 2016 National Academies reports acknowledging potential links despite no broad statistical proof. The attorney leans in, his voice urgent, eyes alight with strategy. This isn't just testimony anymore. This is corroboration. Documents tied directly to medical evidence, showing violations of the Nuremberg Code on human experimentation. It's the chain they've been denying exists, the smoking gun for class actions. He lifts the pages carefully, as if they might crumble, yet his tone sharpens with every word, referencing similar revelations in 2003 hearings. For the first time, there is legal ground to stand on, a bridge between lived experience and written proof, potentially unlocking compensation under expanded VA rules. Images of the table are intercut with archival footage of warheads being loaded onto aircraft at Johnston Atoll, protective-suited technicians handling canisters labeled hazardous, and men on deck staring into drifting clouds, their faces unknowing. The juxtaposition is jarring. While officials assured the public of safe testing in press releases, the hidden documents reveal that sailors and soldiers were, in fact, standing under weapons-grade releases, with minimal monitoring. The audience is forced to confront the scale of deception, no longer hypothetical but proven line by line, including unacknowledged tests outside SHAD, like urban releases in the 1950s that informed Project 112. The journalist, voice low but steady, poses the central question. If they admitted to using only harmless simulants in 2002, how do they explain these pages listing live agents like staphylococcal enterotoxin in Eager Bell Phase 2? The silence that follows is louder than denial. The truth has slipped through the cracks of redaction, and once revealed, it cannot be unseen, sparking renewed calls for full disclosure. The camera returns to the veterans. They do not celebrate. They sit heavy with the knowledge that their suffering has finally been named, tears welling as they share stories of lost comrades. For decades, they were told it was in their heads, or worse, that nothing at all happened. Now, the language of bureaucracy has betrayed itself, exposing what the men always knew in their bones, from the technician's persistent neuropathy to the sailor's lung scars. But the fight is not over. Proof on paper is only the beginning. To force acknowledgement, Someone must carry these documents into the halls of power, into the offices where denials are scripted and budgets for veteran care are debated. The next step is confrontation, not in archives or kitchens, but face-to-face with the very institutions that built this wall of silence, from DoD briefings to VA hearings. The storm of truth is about to break through the doors of authority, demanding not just words, but action. The doors of bureaucracy open reluctantly, their hinges groaning as if unused to such pressure from outsiders. Cameras follow the veteran and the journalist as they step into the stark hallways of government buildings. The Pentagon's earring, VA headquarters in Washington. Places where truth is usually filtered into language so precise it forgets to sound human, sanitized for reports to Congress. The attorney carries the documents like contraband, knowing that inside these folders are words the officials can no longer deny. Live agent lists that contradict decades of testimony. What was once whispers between sailors and widows is now ink on government letterhead. Evidence too sharp to ignore, bolstered by precedents from Gulf War syndrome cases. The first meetings are scripted, predictable, held in conference rooms with American flags and bottled water. Officials sit stiffly in press suits, repeating the phrases audiences have heard for decades. Context of the era, invoking Cold War fears of Soviet bioweapons. Insufficient data, despite stacks of studies. Classified at the time for national security, as if that excuses the aftermath. Their tone is calm, practiced, but their eyes flick nervously to the stack of papers on the table. Pages that list VX exposures in 1968 tests. The journalist reads aloud from the unearthed tables, his voice steady and accusatory. Aerosolized VX, dispersal over naval vessels, May 1964, with expected penetration rates of 20%. The room shifts. For the first time, denial is met with documented fact, the air thick with discomfort. The veteran's moment comes unexpectedly, a poignant beat in the narrative. His hands tremble as he unfolds his personal log, the same pages he carried for half a lifetime, now evidence in a battle he never asked for. In the sterile glow of the conference room, he speaks the names of operations the government never meant to be spoken aloud in public. Shady Grove with Serratia, Copperhead with Tracers, Autumn Gold with BG. The words hang in the air, heavy with decades of silence, each one tied to a memory of illness. Across the table, one official clears his throat, suddenly unsure of the script, glancing at colleagues for cues. For the first time in years, the veteran feels his voice land like a strike, empowered by the 2016 IOM report that, while inconclusive, urged further study. Confronted with overlapping timelines, official dispersal tables from Deseret, medical records showing symptom onset, eyewitness testimony from multiple vets, some officials begin to shift their language, a subtle crack under pressure. They no longer flatly deny. Instead, they pivot. We recognize there may have been exposures in select cases. We are open to reassessing certain claims under the PACT Act expansions. Promises emerge to expand the review process and to consider releasing additional files on Panama and Canadian tests. It is not full admission, but it is movement, the kind bureaucracies make only when forced against the wall by lawsuits and media scrutiny. The attorney presses harder, his arguments honed from years of VA appeals. You've said for years there was no proof. Here is proof, live agents, not simulants. You've said there were no names. Here are names of ships, dates, even dosages. You've said the tests were safe. Here are chemicals that are weapons by every definition, banned under treaties we signed. His words slice through the room, and for once, there is no immediate reply, just notes scribbled and promises of follow-up. The silence itself is a crack in the armor, echoing the 2002 hearings where DoD admitted partial truths after veteran outcry. Outside, in the corridor lined with portraits of past secretaries, the journalist speaks directly to camera, his expression resolute. This is not just about records. It's about recognition, about a sailor's right to know what he stood under, about families' right to answers for generational health issues, about the public's right to see the past as it was, not as it was written to appear in sanitized fact sheets. His words echo the theme that has driven the entire investigation. Secrecy may serve the state, but it robs the citizen. as seen in the slow declassifications that only came after GAO audits exposed delays. The veteran, standing quietly nearby, doesn't speak in grand declarations. Instead, he says only this: for the first time, they didn't say no. For the first time, they had to look me in the eye and see the man, not the number. His expression carries both relief and grief, the strange victory of being proven right after decades of pain, of watching friends die without validation. The chapter closes not on celebration, but on a fragile shift in tone. Promises of further disclosure, tentative steps toward veteran recognition through expanded VA priority groups, the faintest suggestion of accountability via internal reviews. Yet much remains hidden, many files still locked in classified vaults, tests like those in the UK or Canada only partially acknowledged. The confrontation has cracked the wall, but the fog of secrecy has not fully lifted. The camera lingers on the veteran's face, then on the stack of documents that open the door. The question becomes, what happens after the confrontation? What kind of truth remains when the dust settles and the fog clears? The answer lies in the final reckoning. After the mist, where healing begins, but scars endure. The camera opens on a calm sea. The water glitters in the sunlight, innocent and endless, a mirror of the same ocean where invisible clouds once drifted, now peaceful as if absolving the past. The voiceover reminds us, history doesn't always end with clarity. For Project 112, the story closes not with a neat resolution, but with fragments, acknowledgement in some places like the VA's 2023 expansions for SHAD vets, silence in others where full rosters remain classified. The government has admitted only parts of the truth, leaving entire chapters sealed behind redactions, such as details on international collaborations or canceled tests. Yet for the men who stood on those decks, and the families who carried the weight of denial, even partial recognition is a victory, a hard-won step toward justice. Our veteran sits in a clinic now, a medical bracelet on his wrist, surrounded by the hum of machines. After years of rejection, he has finally been granted access to care under Priority Group 6, specialized exams for chemical exposures. The letter that once said, unable to confirm exposure, has been replaced by another, service connection established for respiratory conditions. His relief is quiet, tinged with the bitterness of lost decades, of comrades who passed before seeing this day. He doesn't speak of triumph. He speaks of time. Time that can't be reclaimed. Friends from the USS Fort Snelling who won't live to see the same acknowledgement. Their widows still fighting for survivor benefits. It's too late for some of us, he murmurs, his voice heavy, but he adds a note of hope. At least my grandkids know the truth now, not the lies. The journalist reflects on his journey through the labyrinth of files and silence, now advocating through articles and podcasts. He no longer sees the investigation as just uncovering a hidden Cold War project. It is something larger, a warning about the costs of unchecked power. National security is supposed to protect the people, he says, staring into the lens with intensity. But when secrecy becomes a shield against accountability, it endangers the very citizens it claims to defend, turning patriots into test subjects without consent. His words carry the weight of every black bar, every denial letter, every evasive phrase encountered along the way, echoing criticisms from the 2004 GAO report on DoD's incomplete efforts. Families gather around tables, photographs spread before them. Sailors in their youth, faces sunburned and smiling aboard ships like the USS Talovana, unaware of the mists to come. Widows hold folded flags from military funerals, tears tracing familiar paths. Children point to documents where their father's ship is finally listed in connection to Operation Shad, or their grandfather's unit in Alaska's Devil Hole. For them, truth is more than a matter of history. It is a matter of memory, of knowing they were not misled by rumor or by grief, of validating stories told at bedtime. We weren't imagining it, one daughter says softly, her voice breaking. It was real, the fevers, the pains, and now they can't take that away, not with the fact sheets listing the agents. The attorney, standing among stacks of case files in his office, speaks of the future with determination. The fight doesn't end here. Documents remain sealed, like full details on Panama's jungle tests or the UK's involvement. Cases remain denied for lack of direct evidence. The record is incomplete. But once cracks appear in the wall, the whole structure can fall. Through lawsuits, through advocacy, through persistence. His tone is steady, resolute, referencing ongoing pushes for presumptive conditions similar to those for burn pit exposures. The law, like the truth, can be slow. But both have a way of outlasting secrecy, as seen in the 2025 DoD website launch for chemical exposures. Archival footage rolls one last time. Ships plowing through the Pacific during half-note, plumes unfurling across frozen Alaskan valleys in sundown, humid winds curling through Hawaiian coves in autumn gold, even glimpses of Canadian prairies in copperhead. Overlaid with these images are the voices of veterans, each repeating the same refrain. We deserve to know. It is not anger now, but affirmation, a statement that reverberates across decades, joined by echoes from Panama and the UK. The camera returns to the sea where it all began. The waves roll endlessly, erasing footprints and wake lines alike, but unable to wash away the legacy. The narrator leaves us with a final thought. Experiments may be hidden, files may be burned, but memory endures. The men who lived under those clouds carried the truth in their bodies. And now, finally, the world carries it too, through stories shared, laws changed, and a commitment to never let such secrecy prevail again. The frame holds for a moment on the horizon. Blue, quiet, deceptively peaceful. Then it cuts to the families standing together, their silence more powerful than any denial, united in resilience. The fog has not fully lifted, but enough has cleared for the truth to breathe, for healing to begin. After the mist, there is no going back. The story will not disappear again, and neither will the call for full accountability.